I want to start today with a number. Just one number. Sit with it for a second before we go any further. 55%. That is the percentage of Americans who identify as left of center who told researchers at Rutgers University in 2025 that if someone murdered Donald Trump, it would be at least somewhat justified. More than half. And if that number doesn't make you stop cold, let me give you another one. Nearly 15% of those same left-of-center respondents said murdering the sitting president of the United States was completely justified. Not somewhat. Completely. A 7 out of 7 on the scale. This was not a fringe online poll. This was a peer-reviewed study conducted by the Network Contagion Research Institute and Rutgers University, one of the oldest and most respected public universities in this country. And you didn't hear about it. Not from Clinton News Network, not from misinformation spread by narcissists brainwashing credulous, not from the New York Times. Because if those numbers had come from a poll of conservatives about a Democrat president, it would have been the only story on television for 3 weeks straight. But when the left produces numbers like that, the media decides the story isn't worth covering. That isn't journalism. That's protection. That's a political operation dressed up in a press badge. That poll is where we're starting today because it tells you everything that you need to know about where the American left is right now. We're not talking about policy disagreements. We're not talking about people who want higher taxes or a bigger social safety net. We're talking about a movement that has drifted so far from any recognizable democratic norm that more than half of its members are willing to tell a university researcher on record that political assassination is justified. That's not a political party. That is a radicalization problem, and it's happening in plain sight while the media looks the other way. And today, we're going to document it. The assassination rhetoric, the institutional power grabs, the culture war escalation, the internal collapse, and the spiritual emptiness underneath all of it that is driving people toward darkness.
The independent media company The Truth in the Darkness Network presents the Courage in the Darkness show with your host Philip Roberts, shutting down the narrative and bringing you the truth that the indoctrinated leftist sheep can't handle.
Let's start with the Rutgers poll because it deserves more than a headline. The Network Contagion Research Institute surveyed 1,264 Americans and asked them directly about political violence. Among those who identified as left of center, 55.2% said that if someone murdered Donald Trump, it would be at least somewhat justified. 50% said the same about Elon Musk. Let that sit for a moment. We're not talking about people saying they disagree with Trump's policies or think Elon Musk is a bad businessman. We are talking about people saying that killing a specific human being is morally justified. And a majority of self-identified leftists agreed. Now ask yourself, what would the national conversation look like if a Rutgers poll had found that 55% of conservatives believed assassinating Joe Biden was justified? There would be congressional hearings. There would be demands for the Republican Party to formally condemn it. Every Republican politician in the country would be chased down a hallway by a reporter demanding they denounce it on camera. The story would not leave the front page for a month, but because the targets are Trump and Musk, because the sentiment comes from the left, the poll gets a few days of coverage in conservative media, and then it disappears. That asymmetry is itself a story. That asymmetry tells you exactly how much the mainstream press has abandoned any pretense of equal treatment. But the poll does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a broader pattern of rhetoric and behavior that the left's political and media establishment has either encouraged, excused, or simply refused to confront. Think about what the last several years have actually looked like. Think about the celebrations, open, public, gleeful celebrations when news broke that Donald Trump had been shot at in Butler, Pennsylvania. Not from anonymous accounts, from verified, public-facing progressives with large audiences who could not conceal their disappointment that the shooter had missed. Think about the mainstream commentary that spent years framing every legal action against Trump not as a pursuit of justice, but as a political weapon, and then acted shocked when their own base took that framing to its logical conclusion. If you spend years telling people that a man is literally Hitler, that he is an existential threat to democracy itself, that stopping him justifies any means necessary, do not be surprised when your followers start to believe you. This is the direct line between irresponsible rhetoric and the normalization of political violence. You do not go from a functioning Democrat culture to 55% of one ideological coalition endorsing assassination in a single step. You get there gradually, through years of escalating language, years of treating political opponents as not just wrong, but evil, years of framing every election as the last chance to stop a fascist takeover. When you build that kind of pressure inside a political movement, it has to go somewhere. And right now, it's going toward a place that should terrify every American who still believes in the idea of democratic self-governance. The left talks endlessly about threats to democracy. They have made it the centerpiece of their political identity for the better part of a decade. And yet, here is a Rutgers poll showing that the majority of their own coalition believes murdering political opponents is justified. If you can't see the contradiction there, if you can't acknowledge that a movement endorsing assassination is itself the threat to democracy, then you are not actually concerned about democracy. You're concerned about power. And the difference between those two things is everything. Now let's talk about what the left is trying to do to the institutions of this country. Because the assassination poll is the most alarming data point, but it's not the only one. The radicalization of the American left is not just a cultural phenomenon. It's a political program. And that program, examined honestly, represents the most aggressive attempt to reshape American institutions since the New Deal. Start with the Supreme Court. The push to pack the Supreme Court, to add justices until the ideological balance flips, is not a fringe position anymore. It's been endorsed by sitting members of Congress, by prominent progressive intellectuals, by major left-wing advocacy organizations, and by a significant portion of the Democrat base. Think about what that actually means. The Supreme Court has had 9 justices since 1869. That's not an accident. That is a deliberate structural choice designed to insulate the court from the kind of political manipulation that court packing represents. Franklin Roosevelt tried it in 1937 and was rejected by his own party because the Democrats in that era still understood that some norms exist for a reason. Today's left does not operate with that restraint. They have decided that if a court does not produce the outcomes they want, the correct response is to manufacture a majority by adding seats until they get one. That's not reforming an institution. That is destroying it. Then there is the spending agenda. The proposals that have been seriously advanced by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party over the last several years represent a fundamental transformation of the relationship between the federal government and the American economy. We're talking about programs priced in the tens of trillions of dollars, paid for through a combination of debt, money creation, and tax increases on a scale this country has never seen. The stated goal of some of these proposals, and this is not a caricature, this is the actual policy position, is to abolish entire industries, not regulate them, not transition them, abolish them. The fossil fuel industry employs hundreds of thousands of Americans in good paying jobs. It powers the homes and vehicles of every person in this country. And the radical wing of the Democrat Party has decided that those jobs should be eliminated, that those families should be displaced as a matter of deliberate policy. And when you ask how those families are supposed to survive the transition, the answer you get is a vague promise about green jobs that somehow never materializes in the communities that need them most. And then there's the anti-Trump hysteria that has consumed so much of the left's energy and so distorted its political judgment. The legal campaign against Donald Trump, the indictments, the civil cases, the coordinated efforts across multiple jurisdictions was sold to the public as a straightforward application of the rule of law, equal justice, no one above the law. But the results tell a different story. Every single prosecution became a fundraising event for Trump. Every indictment added to his poll numbers. Every perp walk made him a bigger figure in the eyes of his supporters, not a smaller one. The left built a martyr. They knew they were building a martyr, and they could not stop themselves because the rage had overtaken the strategy. When a political movement is operating primarily on emotion, when the goal is not to win, but to punish, not to govern, but to destroy, it makes catastrophic strategic errors, and it pays for them at the ballot box. November 2024 was the payment. Now I want to talk about the cultural dimension of this, because the political radicalization of the left does not exist in a vacuum. It is the political expression of a broader cultural project that has been underway in American institutions for decades and has recently accelerated to a pace that is producing genuine social fracture. Think about where we were 20 years ago on the major cultural fault lines in this country. 20 years ago, the mainstream position of the Democrat Party on biological sex was that there were two of them. 20 years ago, the mainstream position on parental rights in education was that parents have a fundamental role in deciding what their children are taught. 20 years ago, the mainstream position on free speech was that the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not censorship. Every single one of those positions has been not just abandoned, but actively reversed by the modern progressive left. And anyone who holds the position that was mainstream Democrat orthodoxy 20 years ago is now labeled as a bigot, a transphobe, a fascist, or worse. This is not organic cultural evolution. This is ideological capture accelerated by institutional consolidation. The universities moved first, producing a generation of activists who then moved into media, corporate human resources, nonprofit organizations, and government bureaucracies. Those institutions then began enforcing the new orthodoxy, punishing dissent, and redefining the acceptable boundaries of public discourse. Parents who showed up at school board meetings to ask questions about curriculum were labeled domestic terrorists by the Department of Justice. Doctors who expressed concerns about experimental medical interventions on children were threatened with professional sanctions. Comedians and writers who made jokes that violated the new cultural rules found themselves unemployed and unpersonable. This is not a left that's trying to persuade. This is a left that has decided it has the institutional power to compel. And the results are visible everywhere you look. A country that was already divided is divided in ways that feel genuinely irreconcilable, not because people disagree about policy. Disagreement about policy is healthy. It's the engine of democratic governance. But because one side has decided that the other side's views are not legitimate disagreements, but moral crimes. When you tell half the country that their values are evil, that their religion is bigotry, that their traditions are oppression, you do not produce persuasion. You produce resentment. You produce backlash. You produce the electoral results of 2024. Where working class voters of every race and background moved toward Donald Trump in numbers that no one in the mainstream press had predicted because they'd spent too long living inside the bubble to understand what was building outside of it. There is also something deeply pessimistic at the core of the modern left that deserves to be named. Listen to how they talk. Everything is a catastrophe. The climate is going to end civilization. Democracy is on the verge of permanent collapse. Fascism is around every corner. Every election is the last election. Every policy debate is an existential emergency. There is no positive vision, no forward-looking agenda, no picture of what a successful America looks like that they're working toward. There's only crisis management, emergency response, and the perpetual mobilization of fear. That is not a governing philosophy. That's a trauma response at a civilizational scale, and it's producing exactly the kind of desperate, by any means necessary thinking that shows up in an assassination poll where 55% of your coalition says murder is justified. Even voices within the left are starting to say this out loud. There are Democrats, not conservatives pretending to be Democrats, actual lifelong Democrats who are publicly warning that the party has moved so far from the center that it's losing its ability to speak to ordinary working Americans. They're being ignored or attacked for saying so because the progressive base has become so emotionally invested in its own radicalism that the very act of questioning it feels like a betrayal. That is the definition of a movement that has lost the ability to self-correct. And movements that lose the ability to self-correct do not moderate over time. They escalate. I want to talk about what is really underneath all of this, because I think if you look honestly at the modern American left, the assassination polls, the power grabs, the culture war, the perpetual catastrophism, you are looking at something that is fundamentally a spiritual crisis dressed up as a political program. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We're built for it. We need a story about why we're here, what we owe each other, and what is worth living and dying for. For most of human history, that story was provided by religious faith. Not perfectly, not without corruption or abuse, but the framework was there. A God who made the world and called it good. A human being made in his image with inherent dignity. A moral order that exists independent of whoever has power in a given moment. A future that is not simply the product of human will, but is held in the hands larger than ours. The modern left has systematically dismantled that framework, not just in its own thinking, but in the institutions it controls. Universities that once existed to transmit civilization now exist to deconstruct it. Media that once operated with at least a nominal commitment to truth now operates as an instrument of narrative management. A therapeutic culture that has replaced the language of sin, redemption, and moral responsibility with the language of trauma, victimhood, and systemic oppression. And what you're left with when you subtract God from the human equation is a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Sometimes they get filled with ideology, sometimes with rage, sometimes with the kind of apocalyptic thinking that looks at a political opponent and decides that murdering him is not just permissible, but righteous. The left has its own religion now. It has saints, the approved victims whose suffering must be ritualized and commemorated. It has heretics, anyone who questions the orthodoxy on race, gender, climate, or any of the other sacred categories. It has its own eschatology, the coming climate apocalypse, the rise of fascism, that functions exactly like religious end times theology, complete with the urgency and the moral license that comes from believing you are living in the last days. It has its own original sin, whiteness, straightness, America itself, for which no act of contrition is ever fully sufficient. This isn't politics. This is religion. It's just religion with no God, no grace, and no redemption. And a religion with no grace and no redemption produces exactly the kind of merciless, totalizing, punishment-oriented culture that we're watching the left become. The Christian response to this is not despair. It's not to match the left's rage with our own. The book of Romans tells us not to be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good. That is an active instruction. It's not telling you to sit quietly and hope things get better. It's telling you to build something, to speak truth where lies are being told, to extend dignity to people the culture has decided to discard, to model the kind of confident, grounded, forward-looking faith that is the actual alternative to the left's apocalypticism. The left offers its followers a story in which the world is ending and the only response is rage. We offer a story in which the world is fallen, but it's redeemable, in which human beings have a genuine worth, and in which the future is not determined by whoever controls the institutions today. That is the better story, and better stories told with courage and conviction change the world. They have before. They can again, but only if we're willing to tell them. Only if we refuse the silence that the system is designed to impose on us. Only if we keep showing up, keep speaking truth, and keep building the alternative that makes their control irrelevant. Let me wrap this up and tie this all together for you. The American left is in the middle of a radicalization crisis that the mainstream media is actively refusing to cover honestly. A Rutgers University study found that 55% of left-of-center Americans believe murdering Donald Trump is at least somewhat justified. That number should have produced a national reckoning. Instead, it produced a news cycle because the institutions that are supposed to hold power accountable have been captured by the same ideological project they should be scrutinizing. The political program flowing from that radicalization is not subtle. Court packing designed to manufacture judicial outcomes, spending proposals that would transform the American economy and deliberately eliminate entire industries, a legal campaign against political opponents that backfired spectacularly and produced the very martyr it was designed to destroy. An electoral strategy so disconnected from the concerns of ordinary Americans that the working class abandoned the party that spent decades claiming to represent them. The cultural project is producing visible social fracture, a generation of institutional capture that has turned universities, media, and corporations into enforcement mechanisms for an orthodoxy that the majority of Americans do not share. A culture war fought not through persuasion, but through punishment. A pessimism so deep that it's replaced any positive vision with permanent crisis management and the moral license that comes from believing civilization is always 2 minutes from collapse. And underneath it all, a spiritual vacuum that fills with rage because it's been systematically emptied of everything that once gave human beings the capacity to live with uncertainty, loss, and disagreement without reaching for violence. This is the complete picture, and the response to it is not to match their energy. It's to offer something better, truth instead of narrative, genuine faith instead of political religion, a country worth loving instead of a country worth burning down, a future worth building instead of a catastrophe worth exploiting. That's the work, and it starts with refusing to be silent, refusing to let that 55% number disappear into the news cycle without being named for what it is, refusing to pretend that what we are watching is normal democratic politics rather than a radicalization crisis with real consequences for real people. I name it here every week because someone has to. And before I go, I need to ask for your support. This show runs on you, not on advertisers, not corporate money, not political handlers who want to manage what we say and which stories I cover. Just you. What you heard today. The Rutgers Assassination poll, the institutional power grab, the cultural radicalization, the spiritual emptiness driving all of it. You're not going to hear it assembled this way anywhere else. Not from Clinton News Network, not from misinformation spread by narcissists brainwashing credulous. Not from most of the right-wing media that's too busy chasing engagement to do actual analytical work. I do the work. I stay independent doing it. And I can only keep doing it because of listeners like you who understand what's at stake. Go to titdusa.com and find the Stand Against the Silence campaign. Whatever you can give goes directly into keeping this voice on the air. If you already are a subscriber, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. That's how we fight the narrative control together. Find me on YouTube, search Courage in the Darkness. I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. Subscribe wherever you listen. Leave a review. It matters more than you know. The silence they want from us, we refuse it together every single week. Stand with me, support the mission, refuse the silence, and I'll see you next time.